and the founder of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have with us today Tom Fanning. Tom, as many of you know, is the chairman, the CEO of Southern Electric, and indeed has been very much a part of the commission, the National Solarium Commission on Cybersecurity and cyberspace. We're delighted to have him. He also is a graduate, both with a bachelor's and a master's from Georgia Tech. And I'm delighted that Georgia Tech is a part of our university consortium at the Institute. And I can tell you that there are faculty members, students, and administrators alike at Georgia Tech who are aware of this and are looking forward to the next hour that we spend together talking about the importance of cybersecurity. So, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, Jim, it's so great being with you on this lovely spring day.
Well, that's great, and it's pretty nice here in Washington D.C. as well. But you know, Tom, it's incredible to realize that here you are. You've been a chief international officer who became the CEO of a company, which is a rare route for CEOs of any company or industry here in the United States. I think all of us would be fascinated in finding out what you have learned over this period of time since you entered the industry on how important cybersecurity has become, how it's evolved. How would you address that?
Yeah, you know, it's fascinating. Southern Company is very rigorous in terms of how we progress contenders for the throne, if you will. And we almost have this concept, we kind of laughingly inside the washroom or whatever, we call them merit badges, that, you know, we want to understand production, we understand marketing, we understand finance, and more often than not. And I think I am kind of a rare bird in our industry, in the electricity industry, in that I think I'm the only CEO that was a CIO, a Chief Information Officer. You know, we were chatting earlier. I said, you know, most days when I had that job, I thought it stood for career is over. I mean, being the Chief Information Officer of a major, we were worldwide then, company was just a real challenge. But, you know, as I think about it now and I start to plan for my successor, this idea of having competence in the virtual world and having digital capabilities and understanding new ways to access markets and customers with different kinds of offerings. So much of that is rooted on this idea of a transformative marketplace. And I think if you can't speak the language, I think if you can't kind of understand the reality of what all that may mean, then I think you really do lose a certain amount of bandwidth in exercising your authority as a CEO. And so that's a critical, important thing. And, you know, I kind of came up with a lot of finance jobs in my background too. And I always use this rubric of value is a function of risk and return. And a lot of what I just expressed to you were kind of elements of return. In other words, how can we better access a marketplace? How can we think about different customer requirements, et cetera? But the risk side of this and this new warfare, this is arguably the most underreported war that America has ever been in, is this cyber conflict we have been in for some time. I think really understanding, especially in a critical infrastructure role like we play, what the capabilities of the bad guys are and how the attack surface and defense obligation changes day to day is really important, I think, to fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility as a CEO. So look, I just think this stuff is so critical, and that's why I've been, I think, so passionate about it.
Yes.
I've led my own industry for cyber and physical and also storms and COVID and everything else for now 7 years. And I've worked to pull together different industries. One of the things I first learned is you can't live in a silo here. So we are interdependent with finance. We're interdependent with telecom. So we created something called the Tri-Sector Group that deals with these issues. Working with Jamie Dimon, Brian Moynihan, we have now merged our ARC, which is an analysis and resilience center. And now, as you mentioned, I'm the only CEO type on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So this is a passion of mine, and I want America to be better for it.
You know, it's interesting. My staff hears me use the term all the time, or the phrase "silos are for farmers," and that there is a true need for us to be able to work together. But I must say that a few years ago, I was simply amazed at the lack of knowledge, let alone understanding, that government had at all for cybersecurity. And when I say government, I say that in a very broad sense. But thank God the commission came into existence to be able to try to remedy that.
Well, let me hit that with two different ideas. Number one, it's pretty well accepted that over 85% of the critical infrastructure in America is owned by the private sector. So how could government really understand the challenges, the attack vectors, the defense options that we all have? I can remember we do these exercises called GridX with the federal government. And I remember we got to a point where the government had to step in. And my question to the lead in the White House was, who are you going to call? What are you going to do? You know, there's this FAST Act authority that the president can invest in the Secretary of Energy to say, you can now take over the grid. How does the Secretary of Energy know what to do? We must collaborate with the private sector. The other thing that I think is very interesting is I spend a lot of time in DC, walking the halls, talking with people and everything else. And even as I describe the work of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, I say that it is not, in fact, bipartisan, it is nonpartisan. And in my working on the Hill, there are so many different committees with jurisdiction. It's very clear to me that whether you're in the administration or in the Senate or in the House of Representatives or in the states, people understand that this is a critically important issue to deal with, but they just don't know how to deal with it. And I think one of the great things that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission has done is given folks a blueprint as to how to move forward on these important issues.
That's incredible. I must admit that we, of course, not only were following, but helping to do what we could in providing input. But this report, I rarely have I seen commissions that have been able to lay out some recommendations in which it was taken to heart. And there were all of a sudden recommendations that were turned into law. I mean, the speed with which that has been accomplished has got to be some kind of a record as far as the U.S. government's concerned.
Well, and you know what? I'm very proud of that because we all are busy. And I'm running this big company, 30,000 people, and we're all over the United States, and we're building the first nuclear plant in a generation of Americans. I mean, I'm a busy guy. So to get involved with something like the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and invest the time that's required, we meet every other week, and there's work to do in between our meetings. I really did want to see it be effective. I think under the leadership of guys like Angus King, like Mark Montgomery, the executive director. I mean, these are people that really do try to get this thing done. We have about half the recommendations now in law, and we're working very hard on the rest of the report. I think the entire report, some of it is very complex, but very elegant, will really make America better. So I'm very committed to pushing through the rest of the ideas.
That's great. Well, you know, when you think about your career and you're having been involved with the Federal Reserve, my goodness gracious, and then also dealing with utilities, you've certainly seen cybersecurity from different perspectives and directions.
Sure.
One of the things I've got to believe, and that is that until recently, companies have got to be somewhat embarrassed to let the world know that they've been hacked, that they've been penetrated in some way, because they don't want anybody to realize that they're not 100% with it. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, but you know what? The reality is really quite the other way. So companies like Southern, so we're critical infrastructure, electricity. We're an integrated company that makes, moves, and sell energy. We get attacked, and I use that a little loosely, but we get attacked about 3 million times a day on the average.
Hmm.
Have we ever been breached? Yeah, but not in an operational sense, not in a sense that would have impaired our ability to fulfill our jobs. But I can tell you the threat is there all the time. And I think there is lots of evidence, given the ease of entry, given the lack of capital required in order for a bad guy to try and change our American way of life, that this is the battleground of the future. You may know that the solarium moniker really came from President Eisenhower back in the 50s. And at the end of World War II, they met in the solarium in the White House. And they were trying to reimagine what national security looked like in a post-World War II environment. On your right, theoretically in the east, was the Soviet Union, and on the left, in the West, was NATO. And essentially, the imagination of conflict was a tank battle on the plains of Poland. These days, the battle of conflict is not on the plains of Poland. Rather, it's on our telecom network. It's on our electric grids. It's on our financial systems. And the impact of a successful undertaking by the bad guys could really change our American way of life. And so this is the conflict space for the future. And we must completely reimagine here how we think about national security through not a partnership and not some cooperation, but rather a collaboration of the private sector and the federal government. You know, in the old days, we had two oceans on each side of us. We had friends north and south, and we were really insulated from this kind of kinetic concept. But in the virtual digital warfare, there are no borders, and there's no way to protect yourself other than a complete reimagination of what we got to do as a country. So these are the principles that I think private sector has to come to grips with. And let me offer a couple more concepts. In all the work that I've been doing here, I've not been as concerned with punks, thugs, and criminals. Criminals, I'm starting to worry about, and I'll get to that in a minute. But punks, thugs, and criminals, I get it, and they want to steal your social security number, and they want to do whatever. What I'm after are largely those people, mostly nation states or derivatives of nation states, that can create for America an existential threat, that can turn off the power, that can disrupt the financial system or impair our ability to communicate. And so therefore, we really do need to think differently. And if you're in that business, so let's differentiate. I love ice cream, so I always use Ben and Jerry's here, but the mission of Southern Company in regards to national security, we run essentially the electricity grid in the Southeast, and we're all over the United States in a variety of other ways. We have a national interest joined with NSA, broadly the intelligence community, our sector-specific agencies, DOD, FBI, Cyber Command, in creating a partnership. As a CEO, the last thing I want to do is have the Russians be able to take out my nukes or impair the electric grid.
Right.
The only way I can be assured of that is to think differently about my collaboration with the federal government. In the days where people were afraid to say that I am vulnerable and I need help, if they're in the critical infrastructure, in my sense, they don't have a choice, they have an obligation. And that is an important realization. So to start, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
No.
But when you start with the premise that CEOs don't want to admit they got vulnerability, sports fans, we all have vulnerability. And what we must do is reimagine the way we're going to work with government to protect ourselves and to protect the United States.
Did you have a feeling, having gone through this process with the commission, that the commission has been able to provide some great guidance to be able to really dig deep into the private sector and make the private sector aware of the vulnerabilities that exist and the need for them to be able to sit up straight and to realize that they do have the responsibility to their clients, to their customers, and to the country at large to be able to deal with all this.
Yeah, but I think the private sector pretty well knew that. Where there were big disconnects is being able to take classified information and put it in the hands of the private sector in a usable way. And I completely understand. I really am sympathetic to the intelligence community to protect their sources. And that's why stuff stays classified, right?
Right.
And so only in, say, TSSCI environments are we able to kind of understand what's coming across the border? Where are the threats? Where are they being generated? And really to learn from others, i.e. the Ukraine, where allegedly Russia operationalized an attack against the Ukraine and took over their electricity grid. So the other thing that we got to understand is, so you have the intelligence community, the sector-specific agencies also have an important role to play in each of their sponsored areas. And if another great group that's worked on this kind of stuff is NIAC, the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. They first, I think, created the idea of what they call lifeline sectors. Homeland Security segmented America into 16 different sectors. And then NIAC said, you know, by threat of cybersecurity, there are probably 3 to 6 that are the most important. And I would say the 3 are the ones we've been talking about: electricity, finance, telecom. And probably the next 3 are transportation, water, and health and public safety. Now, look, I'm not meaning to exclude anybody, but one of the concepts that Solarium is working on is this idea of prioritizing the critical infrastructure of America. It's a brand new kind of concept, but it's something that needs to happen. We can't sit back and say that we're going to protect everything the same way. So I used this, I didn't come back to it, Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I love Ben and Jerry's ice cream. But if they got hacked and disabled, that's a bad day for Ben and Jerry's, but I think America is going to be just fine. If our telecom networks get taken out or the electric grid gets taken out, it's an existential threat, and a bad day for America. And so what we have to do is create a concept where we can essentially triage damage and create special obligations and benefits to the private sector that are involved in those areas. We have this unfortunate acronym called SICI, systemically important critical infrastructure. And then we have another concept that we're working on right now is called this joint analytic environment. And what we can do is take entities that are involved with SICI assets, maybe it's a nuclear submarine base, maybe it's financial systems, maybe it's segments of the electricity grid that are most important. And we will put them into classified space, working together with the intelligence community, sector-specific agencies, and importantly, going back to the Solarium concept of reimagining national defense, this idea of having side-by-side DOD, FBI, Cyber Command, the people that will hold the bad guys accountable. And let's create a relationship where we all see the same thing at the same time. It won't require, Jim, me picking up the phone, calling you in Cyber Command saying, hey, I got a problem. What we have to do is have a joined relationship where the very fabric of American commerce in real-time speed is transparent to us all. The first step and national defense is illuminating the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
Once we do that, then we can take the necessary actions, either offensive or, on my side, defensive.
Sure, sure.
So this is fascinating stuff.
You bet. I'm sure you saw the headlines of today's Wall Street Journal, but it talks about I don't know whether one says cockiness or the assuredness on the part of the Chinese that they now are equals to the United States, that this is a new day, a new dawn. They have quotes from Mao, from Deng Xiaoping, talking about how just be patient, and now their time has come. And you were mentioning the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, now Russia, and its threat. But how do you, and having worked through the commission, perceive what is transpiring with China in regards to cybersecurity?
Well, so let's call out the big four, and then I want to point out another threat, the derivative side. So the big four, right? It's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and all of them have different kind of incentives. Russia tends to be more geopolitical, a la the Ukraine, et cetera. China tends to be much more economic and commercial, especially long-term stealing, intellectual property, et cetera. They really are playing the long game. Iran can be pretty dogmatic with respect to, special interests in the Middle East. And then, of course, North Korea, is always at death's door, it seems like. And so a lot of their cyber mischief is to raise money, to steal, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The derivative side of this is very interesting, too. I always love thinking about these concepts in terms of movies.
Mm-hmm.
In James Bond, the James Bond movies, the bad guys are generally associated with Spectre, right?
Right.
This worldwide criminal enterprise that banded together to do all sorts of things. There is clearly an element of Spectre in the world today. That is, on the dark web, people will take statecraft that may look like Russian or Chinese methods and use it for their own purposes. Normally, that is done to extort or raise money, a la Spectre. But they're getting pretty powerful and pretty intrusive. And like I said, the barriers to entry here are not very high. And so there's a lot of this idea of, besides the big four and the nation states having their own interests, there's now a large and threatening criminal enterprise that's way beyond somebody trying to take your Social Security number. That is a real threat to America. And because they use generally statecraft in their attacks on us, the attribution element of this now becomes ever more difficult. So it's a many-faceted problem. But it's something that I think the United States is well positioned. And let me just say, for all the challenges we face, the folks in the United States government in this regard are terrific. Paul Nakasone at NSA has been terrific. Keith Alexander before him, really brilliant people. When I look at the folks that the Biden administration is putting in place right now, Ann Neuberger, I've been working with her at the National Security Council. Jen Easterly just got put in charge of CISA. So many people are just really helping out and coming to the nation.
That's great. That's great. Tom, we're getting questions from all around the world, believe it or not, at different hours of the day. Here's one. The White House leaders have called for a comprehensive overhaul of cybersecurity to protect U.S. critical infrastructure and data. What are your thoughts on critical infrastructure owners and operators adopting a quote-unquote zero trust architecture for high-value assets?
So here's the aspiration that I have is that there is derived from input from the intelligence community, our sector-specific agencies, DoD, and outsiders, that we will have for critical infrastructure, and I'm talking in the SICI, systemically important critical infrastructure as defined by the Solarium Commission.
Right.
That we will have a clear-eyed view of where not only the threats are, but where they're coming from. In other words, it's skate to where the puck will be, not where it is today.
Mhm.
And that we have a collaboration, a joint effort. So with the federal government. So this idea of trust or the configuration of your defense is one that has to go kind of in three different pieces. The first piece really deals with the idea that in cyber conflict, the United States and the rest of the world must shape behavior using all the powers of state. We've got to be able to exercise via commerce, maybe sanctions, monetary policy, diplomacy, any element of the United States to exercise power, we should have that done. The second is really this idea of DOD, FBI, Cyber Command, but this idea of imposing costs on the adversary and having this idea of continuous engagement, that we're always out there. It doesn't require, Bill, a phone call from me to you. That they are Jim, they are always out there and they always see what's happening to us in real time. And then the third is this idea of denying the bad guys the benefits. However we architect it, with the best of intelligence from the intelligence community and sector-specific agencies and the folks that will hold the bad guys accountable, that we will harden our defenses. And so through this collection, we create a standard of behavior, a recognition on the bad guys that if they attack, that their ability to extract value out of the attack will be lessened, and there will be retribution. There will be a consequence to their attack. Those three things taken together with the collaboration of the private sector will harden America's defense, make our offense better, and make us all safer.
Tom, you're almost talking about putting together a new social contract.
It absolutely is.
Yes, in which all the parties are, for example, the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society is really trying to deal with that you can't close the door in trying to be able to be aware of what government is in the process of doing, how it affects you, how everybody comes together to be able to deal with something like this, because it is so new. Your point, talking about how America was dealing with its defenses after World War II. We effectively were isolated from the rest of the world, but now our fiercest adversaries are certainly one direction and the other direction. But at the end of the day, they can reach us in a nanosecond if they want to be able to impair our very existence.
Well, and let's go to the concept of where we may go. Son of a gun. I have this imagination of an army of people in a nondescript office building in Beijing, China, working to kind of bang and get into our systems. But in the era of the future where we're dealing with artificial intelligence and we're dealing with quantum computing, this millions of times a day becomes completely obviated. And really you're thinking about trillions of times a day and attacks that don't occur in minutes and seconds, but in, as you say, nanoseconds. What do you do now? Where is the kind of very interesting threat of the future is, we all know that artificial intelligence is a great thing, but it's kind of, my old CIO days, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. It can only act in the way that we program it to act. It will learn on its own, but it's been taught how to learn. What if it learns in a way where human intervention can't be intrusive enough to keep it within certain guardrails? These are the nuclear threats of the future in cyberspace. It makes you think of the movies like The Matrix and those kinds of things. It's a fascinating environment.
I should say. Let's talk a little bit about the future. One of the things that we're so involved with at the Institute is trying to work with young people in taking up the gauntlet as far as the challenges that exist in the future. What has your experience been, and what have you observed in regards to the supply and the demand of thinking about cybersecurity and having the talent that businesses can turn to and the government can turn to be able to help them through the weeds on all of this?
Man, that's a big issue. And in fact, I would even argue, you remember the old days of Smokey the Bear?
You bet.
And the United States started a Don't Be a Litter Bug. There's another one.
Right.
These are national campaigns to enlighten the culture of America for the good of America.
Mm-hmm.
And let's start at the lowest level. I think America needs to intervene in our culture today to get people attuned to the fact that there is a certain standard of behavior in this digital economy that we're all in, and it deals with social media, it deals with how you create passwords and everything else. We need to create at the lowest level, my kids' levels, an understanding of what it means to be safe in this environment. Now, let's move that up through education and into the job market. Boy, if you want to get a kid a job and well-paying job and all that, it is this environment, because the attack vectors are only growing in ways that nobody can foresee. And at the same time, we're all becoming more and more and more dependent on the digital economy in order to enact commerce, for heaven's sakes, or even just run our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So in my sense, creating an awareness of where these jobs are, where the opportunities are, and frankly, where the threats are in terms of how you run your life. Mm-hmm. This is something that the Solarium Commission has tried to illuminate a good bit and really tried to speak to. But I think somewhere, if not this administration, the next, we need to start doing a national campaign, starting at the lowest levels, working through education, rethinking what our education requirements are in order to develop productive, safe environments in the future.
You're having gained a great deal of knowledge through your own experience. And then all of a sudden you become a member of the commission. Were there any surprises? Was there any extraordinary knowledge that you gained as a result of having the interaction that you've had with colleagues from both sides of the aisle?
Well, here's the thing. When the commission started out, there was a lot of deputy secretaries of, the different agencies, Homeland Security, NSA, FBI, DOD. And then there were other contributors like Chris Inglis. I mean, what a fabulous guy. He's, I guess, now coming back in. Boy, there's another patriot for America moving in to create just the strongest team imaginable. But when you think about their experiences, Chris Inglis had spent, I'm going to probably screw this up, but maybe 13 years, but over 10 years in the NSA, and also helping, with Cyber Command over here, really getting a broad insight about what the threats are. And they have this, it's almost as if they're looking out the window on America at the rest of the world. And I think we get great insight there. I think that has been so valuable and so eye-opening. I remember we went under a TSSCI environment and Paul Nakasone came in and just went through soup to nuts what he saw in all of this. The DOD guys have been terrific. And then you have a guy like me sitting there, and I see all this, and it is exceedingly eye-opening. Now, I do have TSSCI clearance, so I've, at least within my silo of, mine came from, was granted by the Department of Energy. So within that silo, I got pretty good insight into what was going on. So it was, the bandwidth of what I saw was much bigger. And these guys are brilliant. I mean, these public servants are brilliant. Now, when I look back at what the private sector is dealing with, again, in the old days, I would argue that many CEOs were ignorant of the reality of the threat. And by ignorant, I don't mean to denigrate anybody's intelligence. To me, ignorance is the absence of knowledge. It's a whiteboard.
You bet.
It's not that they're stupid, they just don't know.
Sure.
It is our obligation as a nation of leaders to inform them as to the threats, and based on their position of critical infrastructure or whatever it is, there are special obligations to assure that they're doing everything they should do as fiduciaries, not just to shareholders, but to the national security of America, to run their companies in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think is really pretty transformative with what we're dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And me being the only CEO on the Solarium Commission, that was quite an aha. And so my big thing was, boy, I've got to stop looking out the window and turn around and look back in the house and say, guys, this is what we need to start doing differently. And that gave rise to the tri-sector and all this other stuff. Also, I think the Business Roundtable has been very receptive to these ideas, and the Chamber of Commerce. So look, it's been an enormous education. But with that education comes, so what? I love my new question there.
Yep.
Private sector, we got to take that and translate it into, okay, what am I going to do differently?
Education translates into responsibility.
Yes, sir.
One of the things I find fascinating, you were mentioning Chris Inglis, and Chris, during this interim when he's been out of government, has been a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Yeah.
And just last year, they unveiled a $150 million cyber study center. And anybody who graduates from the U.S. Naval Academy must take X amount of credits when it comes to cybersecurity. And so here these guys are going to be jumping on ships and boats. And at the same time, they need to know what cybersecurity is all about.
Chris is a great friend of mine. He had me actually come out and I spoke to 2 of his classes. And here's the thing. It's a fascinating, and you know who first said this to me was Paul Nakasone. We were working on an idea that used to be classified, and I understand it's not, but it was an idea of collaborating so that he could look in on my networks and think about DOD looking in on my networks. And they want to defend my networks, or Cyber Command wants to go out and maybe do a cyber attack on the power system of a enemy, right? It's very informative for them to get an intimate view as to how I run my business and to how I defend my business, because they can use that to help lead them into saying, oh, this may be a better way to attack somebody else. There's a real input-output mutual benefit here in our alignment. So that was fascinating from these guys, these midshipmen who are just, the nation's tops.
That's great.
We were talking before we got on the program. I actually accepted an appointment to West Point at one time in my career.
Yes, indeed.
Never attended, but I'm so respecting of the capability of these people in defending America. In defending America these days, they must have an appreciation of the private sector. It isn't that they run their aircraft carriers as well as they can. They really do need to understand what the private sector is doing, what vulnerabilities we have, and in that way, they will maximize their education on this whole cyber warfare, cybersecurity element. And let me tell you, Annapolis, it is a terrific facility. Holy smokes, just walked me around. We looked at different labs. It's amazing what they do.
That's great. That's great. Tom, do you think it's fair to say that the cost of attack in cybersecurity is cheaper than the defense that you can have? I mean, when we hear about some of the hacking that's taken place by kids who are in high school and they've all of a sudden downed an entire system overnight. You're saying to yourself, my God, a kid was able to do something like that. And look what we've got to do now to be able to overcome that.
Yeah. Well, I hopefully those were the old days. There was another movie, I can't think of the name of it. Somebody's going to probably text it to you, but where the kid almost started a nuclear war, right?
Yes.
I can't think of the name of it, but let me tell you, my sense is that we've all gotten better, and yeah, maybe that could happen, but my sense is the attacks that will create an existential threat for America are really got to be awfully sophisticated.
Yes,
You
yes,
know, and I
yes.
think this kind of poorly named solar winds effort was kind of that way. We all know, and I hate to even repeat it, but there was so much going on prior to solar winds, and as it
Right.
got through solar winds, it metastasized and went everywhere else.
Yeah.
Saying that solar winds is really kind of a misnomer. But look, I think we're all better off, and we're in a better place. The only one I would say similar but different to your example would be insider threats.
Yes.
So let me give you my own little story there. The lawyers won't let me do this, but here's what I'd like to do. So I said we run the nation's power grid in the Southeast, right? And so not only do we make electricity, we have nuclear plants and gas plants and solar and wind and all that stuff. We move it, got big transmission lines and distribution lines, and then we sell it. I think the crown jewels from a cyber standpoint of what we have is our ability to operate the grid. If somebody could get in and change the way the grid operates or make it not obvious to us that there were power imbalances or anything else, that would be the worst kind of attack we could get.
Sure.
And so what do I worry about there? We certainly are taking steps to protect ourselves. So we have one power grid area. We have another one in another part of the United States that's underground and, you know, EMP protected and all that stuff. We have a third strategy we call spare tire that enables us to get from the scene of the accident to a gas station in an effective way. You wouldn't want to run that way all the time, but we have a way to do that. And the final one is to essentially unplug from the digital world. We call that our MacGyver strategy, where we're creating all sorts of innovative ways to work around not being connected. And in effect, running America's power grid as we did in the 50s.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, there's still challenges, and we think we have some good ideas there. But I hope by this example, you get the idea that major businesses, particularly in the critical infrastructure area, have really done a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. Insider threats are something that I still worry about.
Mm-hmm.
Our company of around 30,000 people, I'm sure there's some people inside Southern that don't like America. You know, the numbers just suggest something like that happens.
Yeah.
So we use an FBI kind of approved method of evaluating personnel. And there are stages of evaluation that the closer you get to critical infrastructure, the greater the oversight. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I would love it. Here again, my lawyers won't let me do this, but I would love it if somebody said, I want to work in the power grid area and I want to be able to control power flows in the Southeast. I want to have complete oversight, not only into what they do at work, but what they do at home. And I want to know if they're on chat rooms, and I want to know if everything, and make that a condition of employment.
Uh-huh.
Look, the stakes are so high that we just have to make, for a national security purpose, the highest level of evaluation in this regard. So we'll see. We take a lot of good steps, and we do behavioral analysis and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, oh boy, this whole area of national security in relation to the private sector's role is something that still has to evolve a good bit.
You bet. You bet. Another question has come in. This gets into the weeds a little bit, and it deals with Sarbanes-Oxley. How important is it for the intelligence support to the private sector?
God bless the Solarium Commission. Let me tell you something. I think this is an area that kind of is inevitable, but the sooner the private sector embraces it, the better off we'll be.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tenets of Sarbanes-Oxley, and I guess all of this was kind of after Enron and a variety of other things,
Right, right.
was to assure that you had, as much as possible, a pristine control environment so that your financial records, your income statement, your balance sheet, your statement of cash flows, and all the disclosures around that,
Mm-hmm.
excuse me, are in a good place. In order to assure that you have good books and records, your control environment, how do I know as CEO that my accountants know everything from the sales people and the operations people and the regulatory people and the political people, that we have a way of collecting this network of information that captures, to the best of our ability, reality as we see it. I would argue, and I have argued, and I think the accounting profession is moving this way anyway, that your cyber hygiene is an important part of assessing your control environment. In other words, if you don't have the cyber hygiene necessary to
Right.
assure that your books and records and your disclosures are all accurate,
Mm-hmm.
then I would argue you have a control failure.
Mm-hmm.
And so my kind of idea at the Solarium Commission was to say, let's add an assessment of your cyber hygiene into your assessment of your control environment. As CEO, CFO, I got to sign a statement that says, I am aware and I understand, and yes, it works. And the board has oversight on me in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're very powerful tools. Ignorance is no absolution in the CEO's responsibility to assure that his cyber hygiene is what it should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, that begins to get me thinking a little bit. You were mentioning earlier about students and having a platform where you could do Smokey the Bear and that sort of thing to make people aware of all this. I'm wondering how to bring business together. I mean, after spending this time with you this morning discussing what you've done, I think has been incredible and has allowed us to have a tremendous amount of appreciation for what you brought to the table. But at the same time, it's kind of regrettable that you were the only private sector person as a CEO sitting on this commission with a lot of government people. And so I'm wondering how ultimately you translate that and you engage the private sector as a whole to be involved in obviously what you've been doing.
Well, look, I'm the only CEO type. There's other kind of private sector people that have been in and out of the private sector, and they've been terrific. Okay. But here's the thing. I think that as we start to develop law around these concepts, there is a very natural place for the private sector to engage. So as you start to, draft bills and everything else, all of the affected parties come together and weigh in on the legislation. It just doesn't get passed without input by the private sector. Further, I would argue the big bodies of the private sector. So say, for example, I'm a member of the Business Roundtable. They've been terrific at kind of weighing in on the original report by the Solarium Commission. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been great. And different special interest groups. My special interest group in the electricity sector is called EEI, the Edison Electric Institute. So there's a telecom flavor, a water flavor, a variety of other things.
Sure.
All the different sectors of the economy are now weighing in on what we need to do to be better. In fact, I'll just tell you, I was working with Ann Neuberger at the National Security Council. She's working on some ideas about a 100-day plan. I've reached out to some of my friends in industry, and a terrific guy, Rob Powelson, who now leads the Water Association. He and I have had several constructive conversations about how can we be better. And at the end of the day, good businesses are always concerned with how can I be better? I find nobody that's trying to stick their head in the sand and say, it's not me, it's not happening. People do understand that as this issue gets illuminated, that they have to deal with it. And what can I do to be better? People are all over that.
When you think about it, obviously the commission came into existence because it was recognized that there was a problem, a serious problem. We've got to address it. We have to address it across all parties, et cetera. With the report having been issued, do you see that the issue of cybersecurity needs to be revisited every so often so that new commissions come into existence, or does this now evolve in unto itself?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, we had a call last night about some of those issues, supply chain issues, a variety of other things. We need to have an evergreen view. Yeah, every 5 years, you may want to have another solarium to take kind of a holistic kind of look down. But in fact, we need to have bodies within the government and really in the private sector to be able to advance the ball. I would argue the financial arc, the Analysis and Resource Center that originated in the finance organization, was such an animal that they said, hey, this is such a big deal. It was really focused on the threats that the finance sector was receiving from cyber warfare and what can we do to get better. Look, I absolutely think this has to be an evergreen proposition, not a once every 2 to 3 years.
Yes,
5 years.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Tom, I can't believe, I wish we could go on and on and on for a long time.
It was a lot of fun.
I think at the end of the day, honestly, we benefit from having spent this hour just discussing all this with you. I know that at the Washington Institute, we are so engaged and so committed to trying to deal with this area. In some ways, quite frankly, I really see the commission and the people involved with it almost as pioneers. This is so new in so many ways, despite the fact it's been around with us, as you were saying, since at least World War II. Now we've just seen ourselves in a position where we've really got to be able to address this and be serious about it. But we can't thank you enough for taking this time and being with us today, and really look forward to watching you and your career and what you're doing at Southern, and also being able to see what happens with the commission and the work that it accomplished.
Well, and Jim, let me say this to you. The Washington Institute, bodies like this really do help transform America. They take issues like this and they, for the benefit of everybody, help illuminate kind of the best and the brightest of minds in Washington, in the private sector, to get word out. And I just want to assure everybody, the private sector does get it, and we do understand. We are in no way, and in fact, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is in no way done. You know, this is something that will continue to evolve. I use the 1960s lava lamp. This issue will continue to move over time, and we're going to have to stay on top of it and get ahead of it. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. This was a real pleasure, and looking forward to following you for a long time to come.
Yes, sir. Great being with you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
See you soon.
Take good care. Bye-bye.